She paced the hallway like a ghost, forgotten, unseen. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the jury filed in. No one looked her way, until the foreman cleared his throat and said, "We owe our lives to one name not listed," and called her forward. A woman no one had expected, now standing as the reason justice was possible. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories that blend legal drama with unexpected heroism, consider subscribing for more content that explores the extraordinary courage found in ordinary people. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile corridor of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. At 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, the hallway outside Courtroom 4B should have been bustling with attorneys, clerks, and witnesses preparing for what the media had dubbed the trial of the century. Instead, it was nearly empty except for the occasional court officer and one woman who seemed to exist in the shadows. Margaret Chen sat on the hard wooden bench closest to the courtroom doors, her small frame almost swallowed by an oversized navy blazer that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she clutched a worn manila folder against her chest like a shield. Every few minutes, she would stand, pace to the water fountain, then return to her spot, checking her watch with the mechanical precision of someone who had been keeping vigil for weeks. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B swung open, and Judge Patricia Henley emerged, her black robes flowing behind her as she strode purposefully down the corridor. She paused when she noticed Maggie, her expression softening slightly. "Ms. Chen," Judge Henley said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench. "You know you don't have to wait out here every day? The jury is still deliberating." Maggie stood immediately, smoothing down her blazer with nervous hands. "I know, Your Honor. I need to be here when they reach a verdict." Judge Henley studied the younger woman's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "The defendant's attorneys made it clear you're not welcome in the gallery. Your presence makes their client uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable," Maggie repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "After what he did to those families, to those children, he's uncomfortable because I'm here?" The judge's expression remained neutral, but her eyes conveyed understanding. "The law is complex, Ms. Chen. Sometimes it protects people we wish it wouldn't." Inside the courthouse, District Attorney Rebecca Martinez was pacing her own path in the prosecutor's conference room 3 floors above. At 43, she was the youngest DA in the city's history, and the Cortez case represented the culmination of a 5-year investigation that had consumed her professional life. She paused at the window overlooking the plaza below, where protesters still gathered daily despite the trial being in its 3rd week of jury deliberation. "Any word from the jury?" asked Detective Ray Sullivan as he entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. Martinez shook her head. "Nothing. Judge Henley says they're still requesting evidence re-examination. They've gone through the forensic reports 4 times now." Sullivan, a 22-year veteran of the Chicago PD, set down the coffee cups and joined her at the window. "You think they're struggling with the circumstantial evidence?" "Maybe," Martinez replied, though her voice carried doubt. "Or maybe they're struggling with what wasn't presented." The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with the weight of prosecutorial decisions that had kept certain evidence and certain witnesses from taking the stand. Sullivan knew exactly what she meant, and both of them knew that somewhere in the building, a woman who should have been their star witness was sitting alone in a hallway, legally barred from participating in her own case. Marcus Cortez sat in the defendant's chair in the otherwise empty courtroom, his expensive suit immaculate despite spending the morning in a holding cell. At 47, he still carried himself with the arrogance that had made him one of Chicago's most successful construction contractors before his arrest. His attorney, Patricia Volkov, one of the city's most feared defense lawyers, was reviewing her notes for what she hoped would be closing arguments. "How much longer do you think?" Cortez asked, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans rather than a verdict that could send him to prison for life. Volkov glanced up from her legal pad, her steel gray eyes showing no emotion. "Jury deliberations are unpredictable. Could be hours, could be days. The longer they take, the better for us." "And the Chinese woman? She's still lurking around." "Ms. Chen is not a factor in this trial. Volkov replied curtly. The judge made it clear that her theories are inadmissible. The jury will decide based on evidence, not speculation. What neither the defense nor the prosecution fully understood was that Margaret Chen wasn't waiting in the hallway because she hoped to testify. She was waiting because she knew something that would change everything, and she was praying that somehow justice would find a way despite the legal barriers that had kept her silent. 3 years earlier, Maggie had been a software engineer for the city's building inspection department, a quiet job that involved creating databases and maintaining computer systems that track construction permits, safety violations, and inspection schedules. It was the kind of work that let her blend into the background, which was exactly how she preferred it after immigrating from Taiwan 8 years prior. The first anomaly she noticed was small, a pattern in the inspection data that didn't quite make sense. Buildings that should have failed safety inspections were being approved, but the digital signatures didn't match the timing of when inspectors were actually on site. As a programmer, she understood data in ways that others didn't, and the patterns she was seeing suggested systematic corruption. What started as intellectual curiosity became an obsession when she realized that Marcus Cortez's construction company was at the center of every anomaly. Buildings that should never have passed inspection were being rubber-stamped, often by inspectors who weren't even in the city on the dates their digital signatures appeared in the system. She spent months building a comprehensive database of the discrepancies, working late nights and weekends to correlate inspection data with actual inspector schedules, permit applications, and safety violation reports. What she discovered was a conspiracy that went far beyond simple bribery. It was a systematic dismantling of the city's safety oversight that had put thousands of people at risk. The Riverside Elementary School collapse that killed 7 children and injured 32 others was the inevitable result of this corruption. The building had been approved for a major renovation that included removing load-bearing walls, but the inspection data showed that no structural engineer had ever actually examined the modifications. The digital signature belonged to an inspector who had been in Hawaii on vacation when the final approval was supposedly granted. Maggie took her findings to the FBI, the city inspector general, and eventually to District Attorney Martinez. Her evidence was overwhelming. Thousands of documents, email chains, financial records, and digital forensics that painted a clear picture of systematic corruption that had led directly to the school collapse. But the legal system had other plans. Defense attorney Patricia Volkov filed motion after motion challenging the admissibility of Maggie's evidence. She argued that the data had been obtained without proper warrants, that Maggie had exceeded her authority as a city employee, and that the computer analysis required expert testimony that would confuse rather than clarify the issues for a jury. Judge Henley, bound by rules of evidence that prioritized procedure over truth, granted most of the defense motions. Maggie's comprehensive database was ruled inadmissible. Her analysis of the digital signatures was deemed too technical for jury consideration. Her testimony about the systematic nature of the corruption was barred as speculative. The prosecution was left with what they could prove through conventional investigation: financial records showing suspicious payments, testimony from a few inspectors who were willing to admit they had been bribed, and circumstantial evidence linking Cortez to the school collapse. It was enough to bring charges, but without Maggie's comprehensive evidence, the case felt incomplete. Now, as the jury entered their 4th day of deliberation, Maggie sat in the hallway knowing that the most important evidence in the case would never be heard. She carried her manila folder not because she hoped to be called to testify, but because it contained the truth, and someone needed to bear witness to it. On the morning of the 5th day, something changed in the courthouse atmosphere. Court officers moved with more purpose, attorneys gathered in hushed conferences, and even the maintenance staff seemed to sense that a resolution was approaching. Maggie had arrived at 6:30 a.m., as she had every day for 3 weeks, and taken her place on the wooden bench. She had learned to read the signs, the way Judge Henley's clerk walked a little faster when a verdict was imminent, the way the bailiffs positioned themselves differently when they expected the courtroom to fill quickly. At 2:15 p.m., the courthouse PA system crackled to life. All parties in the matter of People versus Cortez, please report to Courtroom 4B immediately. The jury has reached a verdict. The hallway erupted into controlled chaos as attorneys, reporters, court officers, and family members of the victims converged on the courtroom doors. Maggie pressed herself against the wall, invisible as always, watching as the people who would determine Marcus Cortez's fate filed past her into the courtroom. District Attorney Martinez paused as she passed, making eye contact with Maggie for the first time in weeks. "I'm sorry we couldn't do more," she said quietly, and Maggie nodded, understanding all the legal and political complexities that had led to this moment. As the courtroom doors closed, Maggie returned to her bench, knowing that she would hear the verdict through the walls. Guilty or not guilty, it would travel through the building within minutes. She opened her manila folder and reviewed the documents one more time, not because she needed to memorize them, but because someone needed to remember what the legal system had chosen to forget. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Henley called the court to order as the 12 jurors filed in from the deliberation room. Their faces were solemn, and several looked exhausted from days of debate and discussion. The foreman, a middle-aged accountant named David Rodriguez, carried a folded piece of paper that contained their verdict. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Henley asked. "We have, Your Honor," Rodriguez replied, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested the deliberations had been more complex than anyone anticipated. Marcus Cortez stood with his attorney, his face showing confidence that had been carefully coached but was beginning to crack around the edges. The families of the Riverside Elementary victims filled the gallery behind the prosecution table, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and dread. "On the charge of criminal negligence resulting in death, how do you find?" Rodriguez unfolded the paper, then looked up at the judge with an expression that seemed to carry more weight than a simple guilty or not guilty verdict. "Your Honor, before I read our verdict, the jury has a unanimous request." Judge Henley frowned. This was not standard procedure. "What is the nature of your request?" "We want to hear from Margaret Chen." The courtroom erupted. Defense Attorney Volkov was on her feet immediately, objecting vehemently. District Attorney Martinez looked stunned. Judge Henley banged her gavel repeatedly to restore order. "The jury's request is noted, but Ms. Chen is not a witness in this case. Her testimony has been ruled inadmissible. Please read your verdict." Rodriguez looked at his fellow jurors, several of whom nodded encouragingly. "Your Honor, with respect, we cannot in good conscience render a verdict based solely on the evidence presented to us. We know there's more to this case." Judge Henley's voice carried a warning. "Juror number 1, you are instructed to base your verdict solely on the evidence admitted in this trial. Any outside knowledge or assumptions are not to be considered." "That's just it, Your Honor," said juror number 7, an elderly woman named Patricia Holmes who had been a librarian for 40 years. "We don't have outside knowledge. We have no knowledge at all about why the inspection system failed so completely. The prosecution showed us financial records and told us about bribes, but they never explained how a building that was supposed to be safe collapsed and killed 7 children." Judge Henley was in uncharted territory. In 30 years on the bench, she had never faced a jury revolt of this magnitude. "The court cannot compel testimony that has been ruled inadmissible." "Then we cannot reach a verdict," Rodriguez said firmly. "We've been deliberating for 5 days, and every discussion comes back to the same question. What really happened with the inspection system? Without that information, any verdict we render would be a guess." Outside in the hallway, Maggie could hear raised voices through the thick courtroom doors but couldn't make out specific words. She stood and moved closer, pressing her ear to the door like a child trying to eavesdrop on adult conversations. Inside, Judge Henley was consulting frantically with her clerk and the court reporter. The legal precedent for this situation was unclear. Could a judge declare a mistrial based on a jury's refusal to render a verdict with incomplete information? Could she compel them to decide based solely on admitted evidence? Defense Attorney Volkov was arguing that the jury was being influenced by inadmissible evidence and outside knowledge, demanding that they be instructed to reach a verdict based on what they had heard in court. District Attorney Martinez found herself in the unusual position of partially agreeing with the defense. The rules of evidence existed for important reasons, and allowing juries to demand inadmissible testimony could set a dangerous precedent. But the families of the victims saw something different happening. They saw 12 ordinary citizens recognizing that justice required truth, not just legal procedure. Rodriguez spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of his fellow jurors' convictions. Your Honor, we understand the rules of evidence. We understand that there are legal procedures that must be followed. But we also understand that 7 children died because a building was certified as safe when it wasn't. Someone in this building knows why that happened, and that person is sitting in the hallway outside this courtroom. Judge Henley closed her eyes briefly, weighing 30 years of legal training against the moral authority of 12 citizens who were refusing to participate in what they saw as a charade. When she opened them, her decision was clear. I'm calling a recess. All parties will remain in the courtroom. Bailiff, please ask Ms. Chen to join us. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors, and there was Maggie, still pressed against the wall, her manila folder clutched against her chest. Ma'am, Judge Henley would like to see you. As Maggie entered the courtroom for the first time since the trial began, every eye was on her. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. When she reached the well of the court, Judge Henley addressed her directly. Ms. Chen, the jury has requested to hear from you. Your previous testimony was ruled inadmissible due to procedural issues, but this court now finds itself in an unprecedented situation. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to answer truthfully, understanding that you are under oath and that anything you say may impact this case. Maggie nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Do you have evidence that directly relates to why the Riverside Elementary School building collapsed? Maggie looked at the jury, 12 faces staring back at her with expectation and hope. She looked at the families of the victims, parents who had lost children because of systemic corruption that the legal system had been unable to address. She looked at Marcus Cortez, who was staring at her with unconcealed hatred. Yes, Your Honor. I do. Judge Henley took a deep breath. Present your evidence to the jury. What followed was the most extraordinary testimony in the courthouse's 127-year history. For 3 hours, Margaret Chen walked the jury through her comprehensive analysis of the city's inspection system. She showed them how digital signatures had been falsified, how inspection dates had been backdated, how safety violations had been systematically ignored. She presented financial records that traced the flow of money from Cortez's construction company to city officials. She showed email chains that proved knowledge of safety issues that were deliberately covered up. She demonstrated how the inspection system had been turned into a rubber stamp operation that prioritized profit over public safety. Most damning of all, she showed the specific inspection records for Riverside Elementary School. The building modifications that led to the collapse had been approved by inspectors who were never on site. The structural engineering report that should have identified the weakness in the load-bearing walls was never completed. The final safety certification was issued 3 days before the building collapsed, signed by an inspector who had been in the hospital with pneumonia. As Maggie presented her evidence, the courtroom remained absolutely silent except for the occasional sob from a victim's family member. The jury took notes, asked clarifying questions, and examined documents with the careful attention of people who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Marcus Cortez's confident demeanor crumbled as the scope of the evidence became clear. His attorney attempted several objections, but Judge Henley overruled them all, stating that the jury's right to hear relevant evidence superseded previous procedural rulings. When Maggie finished her presentation, she returned to the witness stand and looked directly at the jury. 7 children died because the system designed to protect them was corrupted. Their deaths weren't an accident. They were the inevitable result of choosing profit over safety, of prioritizing political connections over public welfare. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. I tried to report this corruption through proper channels. I tried to follow procedures. But the procedures were designed to protect the system, not the children who died when that system failed. District Attorney Martinez conducted a brief direct examination, allowing Maggie to explain her background, her methods, and the reliability of her analysis. Defense Attorney Volkov's cross-examination was perfunctory. The evidence was too comprehensive, too well-documented, too obviously accurate to be effectively challenged. When testimony concluded, Judge Henley addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you have now heard evidence that was previously ruled inadmissible due to procedural concerns. You are instructed to consider this evidence along with all other evidence presented during this trial as you deliberate on your verdict. The jury retired for deliberation at 6:30 p.m. They returned 45 minutes later. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Henley asked. Rodriguez stood, his voice clear and strong. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of criminal negligence resulting in death, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers from the victims' families and shouted objections from the defense team. Judge Henley restored order and polled each juror individually, confirming their unanimous verdict. As court officers led Marcus Cortez away in handcuffs, he turned and stared at Maggie with pure hatred. You destroyed everything, he hissed as he passed her seat in the gallery. No, Maggie replied quietly. You destroyed everything. I just made sure people knew about it. In the hallway outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded District Attorney Martinez, demanding to know how evidence that had been ruled inadmissible had suddenly become central to the trial. She deflected most questions, stating that the jury's request had created an unprecedented legal situation that would likely be studied in law schools for decades. But when asked about Margaret Chen's role in securing the conviction, Martinez was direct. Ms. Chen represents the best of public service. She saw corruption, she documented it comprehensively, and she never gave up fighting for justice despite facing overwhelming legal and political obstacles. Judge Henley, in her chambers after the trial concluded, wrote in her personal notes, Today I witnessed something I've never seen in 30 years on the bench, a jury that refused to accept incomplete justice. Their moral authority superseded legal procedure, and the result was a more complete truth than our system typically allows. The appeal was filed within days, focusing on the unprecedented admission of previously excluded evidence. Legal scholars debated whether Judge Henley's decision to allow Maggie's testimony had violated the defendant's rights or had served a higher principle of justice. But in the end, the appeal failed. The circuit court ruled that while Judge Henley's decision was unusual, it was within her discretionary authority as a trial judge, and that the jury's request for complete information was not grounds for overturning an otherwise valid verdict. Marcus Cortez was sentenced to 25 years in prison. 7 other city officials were indicted based on evidence from Maggie's comprehensive database. The city's inspection system was completely overhauled, with new digital safeguards designed to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had led to the Riverside Elementary collapse. 6 months after the trial, Margaret Chen received a letter from David Rodriguez, the jury foreman. It read, in part, We want you to know that what we did in that courtroom wasn't about legal procedure or court rules. It was about recognizing that sometimes justice requires courage from ordinary people. You showed that courage first, by documenting the truth when it was easier to look away. We just followed your example. Maggie framed the letter and hung it in her new office at the Department of Justice, where she now works as a senior forensic analyst specializing in public corruption cases. She had finally found work that matched her skills with her values, investigating systematic corruption in government systems across the country. On the second anniversary of the trial, she returned to Riverside Elementary, which had been rebuilt with proper oversight and inspection procedures. A small memorial garden honored the 7 children who had died, and their families gathered annually to remember them and to celebrate the justice that had finally been served. As Maggie stood in the memorial garden, she reflected on the strange path that had led from a computer programmer's curiosity about data anomalies to a courtroom confrontation that had redefined the relationship between legal procedure and moral justice. She thought about the jury that had refused to accept incomplete truth, the judge who had chosen justice over precedent, and the families who had never given up hope that someone would be held accountable for their children's deaths. Most of all, she thought about the power of one person to make a difference, even when the system seems designed to prevent that difference from being made. She had waited outside that courtroom not because she expected to be called, but because someone needed to bear witness to the truth. In the end, the truth had found its way into the light, not through legal procedure or prosecutorial strategy, but through the moral authority of 12 citizens who had refused to participate in incomplete justice. They had demanded to hear her name, to know her story, to understand the full truth of what had happened. And in calling her forward, they had demonstrated that sometimes the most important witness is the one standing outside the courtroom, holding the truth that everyone else has decided is too complicated to hear.